second here. Well, let's see. I believe we are live streaming now, and um, welcome to those who are joining us here in the Zoom room. Welcome to those of you who are tuning in from afar on YouTube. My name is Max Haven, and I'm one of the directors of the Reimagining Value Action Lab here at Lakehead University. I'm also Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media, and Social Justice, and you've joined us for the fifth and penultimate session of Conspiracies and Counter Games, a summer institute dedicated to questions of gamification, capitalism, and conspiracies. And it's my great pleasure to be joined this session by Hari Kunzru, the novelist, essayist, and podcaster, whom I'll introduce in more detail in a moment. Welcome, Hari.
Hi, nice to be here.
This is, as I mentioned, the fifth session and the second to last session of the Institute, and just an encouragement to join us again on Thursday when we'll be speaking to artist, activist, and rival co-director Cassie Thornton about her project, The Hologram. We have been speaking to a number of people over the last couple of weeks about these strange tangle of questions that have to do with the rise of conspiracies, conspiracy fantasies, and conspiracy thinking in our age. And it's in some ways led up to a conversation I've been looking forward to a great deal with Hari about his latest book, which came out last year, Red Pill, and it's coming out in paper book, I believe, at the end of the month. Am I?
Yeah, imminently. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, everyone can get it. And also has a very nice audiobook version, which you narrate yourself. So Hari, this is only the latest in a long series of novels, beginning with The Impressionist, Transmission, My Revolutions, Gods Without Men, and White Tears. And his work has been translated into over 20 languages. He began as a journalist, and now his stories and articles appear in publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. Were in fact part of this novel appeared as well a few months before it was published, and has recently joined Harper's Magazine as a columnist for their Easy Chair section, writing every other month. Am I correct?
That's right.
Including about conspiracies and conspiracy
Yeah,
fantasies.
that's one that's worth flagging to this audience. I think the first column I wrote was about Q and conspiracy and the kind of the deep history of conspiracy thinking.
Fabulous. And you're also the podcaster behind Into the Zone, which is a show about opposites and how borders are never as clear as we think, which just had its first season about a year ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we made 8 shows, each one about a different opposition, and maybe actually also, yeah, some of the content in that would be relevant to this conversation. You know, I mean, I am very interested in connections and connectivity and how far proliferating connections go, and that was one of the sort of things that we I was very interested in exploring in those podcasts.
It seems to be a common theme even in your novels as well. They all do a kind of phenomenal work, I think, of showing us how deeply entangled things we don't think are as entangled are in some ways in each of their.
I mean, there's a sort of mode I would call, I don't know, you could call it the informational sublime. I mean, the example I always come back to is the end of the first Indiana Jones movie, where they found, the most precious thing, the Ark of the Covenant, and it's, this object of great importance and power, and you see it being taken away and crated up, and then moved off into a warehouse, and I mean, I think it's a CGI shot or it's an artificial rather than any kind of real. But anyway, this shot gets wider and wider and wider, and you see this crate going down the aisle, and there are millions of crates just like it, thousands of crates, and this kind of the vastness of this kind of repository becomes evident in this. This thing is obviously going to get lost there, and all the knowledge and power that it represents is going to get lost, and that kind of feeling seems to be so important to conspiracy thinking. The idea that if you're
Mhm.
searching through the forest of signs, the world of connections, all the millions of boxes that there are to look in, that you will, you know, one day you will find the one that's the kind of key to all mythologies, that will be the answer to everything.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. We've been talking in this institute in the class around which it's based quite a bit about how conspiracy theories offer this kind of like master key, the decoder to kind of put together all moments of esoterica and the kind of
And it's
enduring
sort of
appeal.
artificial. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. It's just
I was going to say it's that kind of artificial simplification that makes them so seductive and so wrong headed. Basically, the idea that, you know, if you do your work of uncovering, you do your research, and then you discover that actually the whole thing is just six dudes in a boardroom somewhere in Switzerland. And if you know if you were to bust down the door and take them out, then everything would be fine again, and there would be no pedophilia, and there would be, you know, truth and happiness and light would reign over. And that's such a sort of, it's such a human impulse to hope that the answer is human scale, and it's such a sort of um it's a kind of collapse of in the face of the vastness and the complexity of the actual world that we inhabit.
Well, this brings me to the first question I was going to ask you, in fact, about the novel Red Pill, which came out last year, and as the title already indicates, has something to do with the rise of the far right and the kind of paranoid conspiracist thinking that animates our age. And just for those who haven't had a chance to read it, without wanting to spoil it too much, it concerns a writer who is not unlike you, from New York City, was born in the UK from mixed race background, has a young family, is a writer who travels to Wannsee, the suburb outside of Berlin, where famously the Nazis met to concoct the final solution, and goes on a writing retreat there at a strange center called the Deuter Center, which is sort of endowed by this West German philanthropist. And in the course of his writing retreat at that center, where he's kind of forced into more or less horrifying interactions with the other writers there, including one whom we'll talk about a little bit later, I hope, Edgar. He begins a descent into a kind of paranoia, which throughout the novel we're never sure is if it's a kind of clinical paranoia or sociological paranoia on some level. And in the course of the novel, he makes the acquaintance of a kind of far right media mastermind. But before we get to maybe some of those characters and nuances, I wanted to begin just by asking why work with a narrator who, in some ways, is very similar to yourself. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, it's part of a larger project. There are three books, two which are out, and then one which I'm working on now. Each of which has at its center a different art form. I mean, there was a book about music called White Tears, and this was a book about text and interpretation. It's about writing, but it's about the interpretation of writing. This writer is a non-fiction writer. He's somebody who has a kind of rather floating amorphous range of interests, and his, you know, his talent is an interpretative talent, I think, rather than maybe a creative talent. He's not somebody who's, you know, who's trying to write poetry. He's somebody who is trying to who is a scholar, among other things, of German Romantic poetry. And so then, you know, I mean, actually, there's a sort of sequence of kind of decisions I had to take, which led me to this position of making him very close to my own biography. I mean, race is one thing. I mean, did I mean, almost on kind of principle, I decided that why not just center somebody who isn't white, who is mixed race, and see what that brings up, especially in the context of Germany.
mm,
I mean, I should say, you know, it does. I mean, it's actually kind of, in a way, weirdly, it's less tricksy than it seems. I mean, it was a sort of, I, it seemed, you know, I wanted this guy to have a conflict between kind of trying to be a good member of his family, trying to be a good father, to a good partner, and yet being consumed by this sense of a kind of apocalyptic situation that was afoot in the world, and very consumed by his own attempts to interpret that. He makes this descent, which I think you're right in saying is very ambiguous between whether it's an actually sort of straightforwardly a psychological breakdown or whether he has actually tuned into something larger in the culture. I mean, and those things aren't really, mutually exclusive. But he is all the time in this book trying to get back home in a sort of literal and metaphorical way. And so all this led me to kind of using a lot of my own background and biography, and the book also did come out of a 6-month stint I had in Berlin at the American Academy there, and I used their geographical location and then put a completely different institution in there. I mean, the institution in the novel has nothing to do with them, as I've maybe been at pains to point out. But
They weren't spying on you, or
yeah, no, they never spied on me. My colleagues there were charming and delightful people, and but Germany is very important to the texture of the book part, and my particular experience of Germany is important because I was there the year that they welcomed many hundreds of thousands of largely Syrian, but also kind of Afghan and other refugees, and it was a logistical thing that was happening. I mean, you were aware that they were trying to find accommodation for a huge influx of people. I mean, literally in gymnasiums, in spare accommodation. And I was in this very sleepy suburb. There were a lot of people who were being hosted in former accommodation that I think was to do with the hospital. And so I would be on a bus in the morning taking my kid to the preschool, and there would be a lot of refugees on the bus as well. And in many interactions in this place, I would be mistaken for a refugee, and that would go one of two ways. Either people would be very exaggeratedly friendly and very welcoming, or very hostile. And so that ambiguity was very interesting to me and that was very particular to my experience. That was another reason to kind of make this character close to me.
when I read the novel for the first time, I mistook it. I in fact listened to it while I was walking, and I mistook the beginning of the novel for a prologue from you, the author, until a few chapters in. I'm like, wait, actually, this is the real thing. Um, but one of the things that it made me think then, and I wanted to ask you, is like, in some way, it felt to me like this novel was a thought experiment about, the novel ends with this kind of climactic moment of Donald Trump getting elected in 2016, and the kind of utter ruin of the kind of epistemological world of the family at the core. The narrator's wife is a prominent lawyer and fundraiser for the Democratic Party. And I wondered if, to some extent, the novel explored the question about how somebody who, I mean, not that your narrator is in any way you, but like, it made me think about what it would mean to explore how someone like you could fall prey to the kinds of paranoia that was kind of circulating at that time, and that we recognized after the fact had been sort of, and the kind of conspiratorial maneuvering that had been key to the upset election in 2016. Am I totally off base with that?
No, I think you're very, very much on base. I mean, I think in some ways it's a book about what people call the Overton window, about the window of acceptable or reasonable discourse. And certainly in the years prior to Trump, there was a kind of grown-up, sensible commentator point of view that certain things were just not possible, and among those would be the election of a candidate like Trump. But there was an increasing kind of disjuncture between what was considered sort of reasonable and possible in sort of, let's say, a mainstream media discourse, and what appeared to be going on elsewhere online. And and as we all know, I mean, more and more of us are living more and more of the time in online in very, very different environments. The idea of a kind of consensual reality is one of the things that's under threat. that's, I think that's at the heart of what I wanted to explore. So what is reasonable? I mean, and who arbitrates what is reasonable? And one of the experiences that I think a lot of let's say kind of elite liberals had with the kind of election of Trump and the campaign beforehand was that their notion of what was plausible in the world was deeply upset and very kind of, so it's sort of shattered, really. But those of us who maybe were looking elsewhere for information as well, or kind of or had kind of cultural contacts elsewhere, it was less of a surprise. I mean, there was a strange, fusion between the kind of world of the Chans of 4chan and the kind of various other, zones around that kind of bit of the internet, and suddenly mainstream political discourse. I mean, who would have thought that of all the internet communities, it would be, Poll that would manage to have such a kind of huge cultural influence. But so Trump was much more explicable if you've been spending too much time on bad bits of the internet as I had been, and I had this experience of being kind of very worried about what was coming down the pike for some years before that, because I don't know. So I mean, we can talk about this in more detail later. But I mean, I've just realised that I'm 51, and I've now been online for more of my life than not. And even back in the early 90s, when I first got an internet connection, and it was still a very sort of marginal thing to do, there was far right content, and I was spending a certain amount of my time kind of checking it out, because it was a sort of, one of the things the early internet was a window onto various subcultures that would have otherwise been inaccessible. Um, you know, who knew about bronies until, and until they're there on the internet and you can go and check it out. It's like, the work of 5 minutes, and suddenly you're sort of deep into that. And so I tracked for years and years. I just, as in a sort of almost hobbyist way, I'd kind of tracked the kind of far right culture without very much thought about why I was doing it, except as a sort of personal early warning system to try and kind of work out who was coming to get me. So I mean, I suppose there's an element of paranoia there. But I did, I'd noticed from the early aughts there was this rise of this highly ironized, very, witty, and extremely dark online culture that mutated from being, just edgelords into people. A subset of those people became actually committed to the ideas that they espoused because it pissed other people off. And so I mean, so one of the things I wanted to try and talk about in the book was that feeling of your personal weird reality suddenly going, becoming the shared reality for everybody, and being made to feel that you are paranoid, or your reaction is excessive, or you are a marginal person, that you are, your concerns, whatever they are not the correct concerns of the sort of dominant people. And so yeah, that, and just that experience of everything feeling connected, and I mean, you brought up Anton, the kind of media figure in the book, and he's somebody who may or may not be almost in control of a troll farm, or kind of like there's a huge quantity of posts in all sorts of different areas that seem to be connected and seem to have the same sensibility, and the inability to actually quite kind of judge whether this is really a thing or whether it's just a projection of the narrator's mind is a lot of the atmosphere of the book.
I want to come back to that atmosphere in a second, and just share that the end of the book, at the party where they sort of see Donald Trump get elected, there was a kind of strange resonance for me, because I was actually in Berlin that day, and then I woke up the following morning to learn of Donald Trump's election, and we went to a bar as early as was slightly earlier than is reasonable, and met some friends, one of whom is originally from Sudan, but is an American and a an aid worker, and another of whom is a computer programmer who spends a lot of time in the dark channels of the web. And they were both, I mean, horrified, but also gleeful, because they both said in their own way, at least nobody thinks I'm crazy anymore.
That
you know,
that I think that's it. That's the reaction I think a lot of people had, and which made it all more the more bizarre, sort of watching media commentators who had spent the previous several years assuring us that this was just not a thing that was going to happen, and that we were going to have this Hillary Clinton presidency and a kind of neoliberalism in the old form would just sort of trundle on, and instead, all bets were off.
hmm hmm I wanted to turn before coming back to the paranoia theme, which I want to bring up again. I wanted to bring up the topic of gender and masculinity in this novel, because in
Mm.
many ways, I mean, it's a very intimate novel about a man suffering a kind of midlife crisis who worries that he's chosen the wrong path in life, and he can't write his book, he can't provide for his family, he can't defend them from the threats he sees in the world. We have his his colleague at the Deuter Center, Edgar, who's a kind of intellectual bully, a kind of positivist terrorist who refuses to accept anything outside of the most crass sociobiological explanations for human behavior. The whole, at least the first part of the novel, perhaps all of the novel, is kind of haunted by the ghost of Heinrich von Kleist, the 19th century, early 19th century Prussian romantic poet who famously killed himself in a suicide pact. You describe as a kind of a early incel type. And then we have, of course, Anton, who is this kind of suave, like a kind of like fit and sexy version of Stephen Bannon, who kind of like is able to kind of manipulate the media. We never know if he's the mastermind behind everything, or as you point out, if he's just trying to present that way. He's the producer of this kind of hyper violent nihilist television series called Blue Lives, which features both like kind of ultra violence of police gone wrong and gone corrupt, along with these kind of strange nihilist philosophical rantings. But I was curious about what kind of attracted you to explore masculinity in this moment through this kind of strange cast of characters, this menagerie.
Well, I think because so much of this revolves around a kind of, I don't know, I guess you could call it a rearguard action by a proponents of a traditionalist masculinity. And the attraction of the right seems to be in large to young men in large part seems to be that it does offer kind of frames for masculine self-expression, for people who've been poorly treated in graduate seminars on feminism or whatever. But this, I mean, there are figures online, like, but think about Bronze Age pervert. I mean, if that's somebody that people know about. I mean, I think in real life he's actually a wussy Romanian academic, but on this persona on the internet is this bodybuilding overman who for whom men are men and women are women, and the kind of old patriarchal values of the judicious application of violence and the suppression of your doubt, among other things, is very attractive, I think, to a certain sort of young man. And the idea of women as these tricky sort of seductive but deceptive creatures who need to be handled in some way. I mean, all this is being retailed by the men's rights people, the pickup artists people. I mean, for whom the idea of the red pill was they were the first people to pick it up from the Matrix. So, notions of masculinity are very much in play, and of course, for in another part of the world, gender is being re-theorized, and ideas about fluidity and people being able to live in ways outside these categories is becoming kind of an important site of political struggle. So I mean, masculinity as, I mean, I mean, if people are very interested in this, especially with relation to the far right, I'd point them towards a kind of classic work of the 1970s called Male Fantasies by Klaus Teweleit, which really trawls through a lot of diaries and visual material that came out around in Germany after the First World War, and shows how certain sort of ideas about masculinity and femininity as well. I mean, this kind of horror of femininity was very, very implicated in the rise of fascism, and I see a lot of that being recapitulated now. And um, and so I think, yeah, you can't really kind of go into this area without encountering these very sort of retrograde notions about gender. And biological essentialism is back in kind of thinking about race and gender. I mean, there were lots of things that I assumed were off the table sometime after the 90s that seem to have come back to haunt us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, One of the things I think you capture really well in the novel is the way that some of these kind of far right formations now often express themselves in this kind of mind bending ironization, this
Mm.
kind of the irony that it's all a joke, but it's also not a joke. We're really just joking about doing these terrible things, but oh wait, we just did them. uh and in a certain way, it ties into something that we've been discussing quite a bit in our institute, which is the kind of game-like quality of a lot of this, the way that it both draws on gamer communities explicitly, as you
Mm.
were mentioning, is sort of from the online subcultures that bred Gamergate and a number of these other phenomena, but that also a lot of the kind of new trends in conspiracism and far right organizing tend to organize themselves a bit like a game. And then it made me think about your narrator, who in some ways feels like he's in a game he can't win and can't control, and he kind of has this projection onto Anton, this kind of alt-right mastermind, if he is indeed that, as the kind of game master, the dungeon master, and in whose labyrinth, I mean, I think you liken it to a labyrinth in the novel too. I just wondered if you could speak about that, and trying to sort through what that kind of ironization game-like quality is of this new ideological formation.
Um, I mean, I wonder whether that's two separate things. I
Mm,
think I mean, I think it's very important. The joking, not joking nexus, I think, is the gate through which so much of this stuff has made its way into the mainstream. I mean, I was joking just now, kind of doing this, and there are all sorts of pictures. I mean, I always think of Stephen Miller's first White House picture, where he may or may not be kind of doing this with the buttons of his jacket. I mean, he's a
mm.
creature of the chans. I mean, that guy is like, everything about him is clearly saturated in this culture, and he has been the man in charge of immigration policy in the US for several years. And um so yeah, this question of irony, and then the irony becoming totally literal, has been a way of kind of end running around a set of media conventions that dominate, kind of gatekeep mainstream discourse. You're supposed
Mm.
to, under traditional sort of journalism rules, you're supposed to kind of be objective and to be kind of giving a fair shake to both sides. And so kind of and it's very, very hard for people who are working with that to even identify, let alone kind of correctly label certain sorts of trollish, joking, not joking discourse. I mean, people putting up helicopter memes and gas oven memes, and then sort of saying, wow, you have no sense of humor. Why, how can you possibly think that I would be interested in putting you in a camp? um and then, sure enough, kind of further down the line, certain masks fall away. But the gamification thing, and the idea of a dungeon master, or a kind of Svengali like controller figure, is very interesting to me. I mean, one of the sources of my own interest in narrative is the kind of teenage period, where I was playing a lot of role playing games and reading a lot of speculative fiction of one kind or another, and the mechanics of a tabletop role playing game with the open endedness, the ability to kind of gamify it, but without the kind of closed system of something like chess or Go, was completely brilliant to me. I mean, it was so exciting, and I failed completely to enthuse many people around me about why, to get them to understand why I was so interested in this, a way of being able, and my becoming a novelist was through that period I had where I was running games for friends, and I understood things about narrative, like when I wanted to kind of slightly put my thumb on the scales for the sake of a good play, rather than being a sort of strict rule enforcer. Um, but the figure of the controller, of the person who is dictating the terms of the game, is very, very attractive. Again, perhaps to somebody who is feeling insecure, who is perhaps does not feel in control in other ways in their lives, and it's also a figure that has a kind of rootedness in more traditional ideas about the bohemian artist. If you think about like the flaneur, the 19th century flaneur, who is going through the crowd, but who's in the crowd, but not of it, who's an observer, who's in some way set apart from the crowd by usually his sensibility, or his kind of intellectual perception. And then there's the figure of the occultist, which again, there's a lot of bleed between interest in esoteric, Western esotericism in particular, I think, and the far right, partly because there is this sort of disdaining of the mass. There's the disdaining of the average. There's the kind of, I am the possessor of secret knowledge that you do not understand. There's this idea of the hand signals of the Masonic signs that you can give in public, but only the other initiates will understand. Incredibly attractive to be part of a
Mhm.
secret society or a brotherhood. I mean, in the this is the US cover of Red Pill, and some people may recognize this picture that's almost obscure. This very famous German romantic picture called "The Traveller Above the Sea of Fog" by Caspar David Friedrich. And the traveller is looking down on the world, and he's looking down on the kind of the fog of the world, the confusion, or the indeterminacy. But he is, on a mountain. He's, above it, literally. And it's become a kind of cliche of thinking about German romanticism, and that is the kind of that's a part of culture that bleeds very kind of directly through some of the histories that I've been talking about into the contemporary figure of the outright dude who thinks that he's red pilled, and
Mhm.
you are you're still kind of caught in the fog. um so yeah, I mean, and again, another from an artistic point of view in the novel, another reason why Germany is a great place to set this book, because there is
Mhm.
this tradition of the romantic individual, and that is so much in the DNA of the current kind of right wing self conception.
Mhm. And the figure in the novel of Kleist, the romantic poet who annihilates himself in his
Yeah,
will
the
to power,
suicidal the
essentially.
suicidal romantic is again a kind of a figure which has a sort of, I mean, Kleist is fascinating. If people don't know Kleist, as I suspect many people don't know Kleist, because he's not widely, he's big in Germany, much less big outside Germany. But he died at 32 in a suicide pact with a woman called Henrietta Vogel, and they went down to the shores of the lake near the lake the Wannsee, and he shot her and then himself. And he'd been trying to find someone to do a suicide pact with for almost as long as he'd been an adult. He proposed joint suicide to, like, almost like kind of people he met in the pub. um, and he was an aristocrat, who kind of screwed up almost every single opportunity he was given. He had a career as an army officer that he couldn't kind of keep going. And, I mean, I think he possibly had PTSD because he was a child soldier in an infantry regiment when he was like 14 or 15, and then he saw bad things in combat, and then was very, very edgy and unsettled, and then quite in contrast to the idea of this traveler above the sea of fog who's self-possessed and self-contained and in control, is the games master, is the controller. This was a guy who was buffeted around, whose desperation to kind of find some sort of meaning in his life led him to write these very weird. I mean, there's some short stories that if you're interested in him, just go find this collection of short stories, the Marquise of O and other stories, and they're full of action. It's like kind of wild things happen, like kind of, oh, I'm about to be executed for a crime I didn't commit, but oh, there's an earthquake, and oh, the prison has fallen down, and I'm escaping, and it's like it's not kind of reasonable or controlled in any way. His stuff is very excessive and kind of highly strung. And so he's a figure that became, I mean, he was a figure that kind of came to me because there he was in the place where I was staying, and he seemed somehow to kind of impose himself on my experience of that place. I would, it was the obvious place to go for a walk in the morning to kind
Mm.
of have to clear my head, was to go to his gravesite, which was just around. So I would do that. And then, hey, Preston, the guy kind of takes over my novel.
We have some questions coming in, which I'm going to relate to in a second.
Sure.
But I wanted to tell you about a couple and ask you about a couple of things that we discussed last class when we were discussing your work in anticipation of you joining us. And one of them is we were discussing what the significance is and why you made the choice to include this kind of story within a story about Monica, who's a young punk near the end of the Cold War, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, who falls in with a group of punks in East Germany, in East Berlin, and eventually gets sort of recruited by the Stasi, the secret police, to become an agent of theirs, at an incredible cost to her own life. I mean, she's of course extremely distraught and depressed at having been sort of recruited to destroy essentially and spy on her friend group. And that character then appears to the narrator because she's the housekeeper at the Deuter Center, where he's at the writing retreat, and he confesses to her his paranoia that he's being spied on, and she sort of says, like, you think you have paranoia? Listen to my story. And then wonderfully concludes after the story by telling him that he's weak and he's going to be chewed up by the world. But what motivated you to include this story within a story here?
There's two reasons. Yeah, as you say, it's a very self-contained story, and it's like a kind of wedge into the rest of the book. The rest of the book concerns this writer narrator and his various troubles. And I mean, the first reason is to do with Berlin. I mean, Berlin obviously has not one, but two experiences of totalitarianism. There's the Nazi period, and then then the East German period, during which the city was divided. And I was thinking a lot about surveillance. I was thinking a lot about selfhood, and I was thinking a lot about the difference between an old school 20th century totalitarianism and the kind of surveillance and control that happens in nominally democratic societies, even in the present day. And I initially started looking at Stasi surveillance of intellectuals, and those are the people you would expect, writers and poets who might be dissidents and might have some sort of cultural support. And I came across increasing references to how worried they'd been about punk,
Mm.
and about how hard they'd cracked down on teenage punks. And I became completely fascinated by the punk subculture of East Germany, which was a subculture that was existing without really any access to speak of to Western music or images of bands. It was a very sort of low bandwidth channel that they had in to try and be punks in the first place. I mean, I in the podcast, if people are interested in this, one of the podcasts is about, I went back to Berlin and interviewed the first punk in East Berlin, who literally is a dude who saw a picture of the Sex Pistols and ripped up his t-shirt, spiked his hair up with soap, and walked out of his front door in a suburb of East Berlin, and was picked up by the secret police. And he said, he had a life where, as a teenager, he was interrogated on a daily basis because they thought that he must be being influenced by the CIA or some other nefarious Western agency that wanted to undermine the morals of the East German youth. And in a funny way, they gave him a political education. He said to me, well, they would keep asking me whether I was an anarchist, and I knew nothing about anarchism. So I went and tried to find out. And he later on, he left music and became a dissident who was involved with the Divender, the kind of the turn, the sort of liberation movement that pushed the East German government into collapse in the late 80s. So in a funny way, this kind of experience of interrogation and of the Stasi very early on in his life, they pushed him in a way that if they just let him get on and make music, he might not have gone. But I wanted to break the circle of the kind of narcissism of this central character, because he is very self-involved, and he is a bougie writer, and it would be nice to have such troubles in some ways, and to really kind of to reset the book around the ways that power does function on people, and totalitarian power does function. I should say that the Stasi had this technique that they called Zersetzung, or corrosion, which was a sort of perversion of various kinds of psychological theory, which they would learn at a Stasi university in the town of Potsdam, just outside Berlin. And you would learn how to corrode or degrade the psychological state of the people who you were targeting, which they would do in very weirdly petty ways, in very weirdly incredibly invasive ways. Like there would be teams of people targeting a single dissident, and say you're the dissident and you go out to the post office to mail a letter. They come into your apartment. They maybe don't do very much in your apartment except move some things around, or just show you that they've been there, or just do things at the edge of perception. You leave something on the right-hand side of your desk, they move it to the left-hand side of your desk. So you sort of suspect that, are you that thing? Are you going mad, or is it a real thing? Is the reason that when you went to the post office they lost your package, is that just bad luck, or is that somebody trying to make that happen for you? When you come outside and the tires of your bike have been slashed, bad luck. And they would do this stuff, and they really did destroy people. I mean, there's a psychologist working in Berlin even today whose practices solely with survivors of the East German regime, who in many cases were never able to adjust to the idea that they weren't being followed and watched, even after sort of objectively, that there was no more Stasi, there was no more East German state. Like, people had been so profoundly kind of invaded by this experience of constant harassment and surveillance that they never really have recovered.
I just want to encourage those folks here with us in the Zoom room that if you want to pose a question, please post it to the chat, or if you want to ask a question live, then just put up your hand and I can call on you. The other thing before we get to those that I wanted to ask you based on our conversation earlier this week was, late last week, was in a certain way, we were trying to understand how to classify this book, because of course it's partly an English class, what genre we would place it in. And there were a number of interesting proposals for that. Some people felt that it was kind of a thriller, and certainly for the narrator, it's a thriller, that he's trying to uncover this incredible crime that only he can see. And like the detective in a thriller, he's alone against the world. But a number of folks thought that perhaps also there is an element of tragedy in this book, and that the narrator in some way is destined for the fall that he's going to take, his fall into paranoia. or maybe it's a tragedy also for the world, in the sense that we should be able to tell from the very beginning of the novel that it will end in the election of Donald Trump. That's something about the kind of the setup of the whole thing, and its focus on masculinity, this sort of romantic self-maximization, the descent of the world into fragmentation, and a kind of inability to put together a kind of cognitive map of it all, leads to both the main character's psychological breakdown, but also the kind of breakdown of reality itself. Do you accept either of those readings, or?
I'm gonna accept both and all. The I mean, he definitely, yeah. I mean, it's a tragedy in the sense that he has personal flaws that will leave him open
Mm,
to this experience. But I mean, I have always had a kind of fascination with. Um, I mean, I've had thrillers. The idea of a thriller is really interesting to me because I mean, a thriller is a kind of mechanism almost as a mechanism as a genre. It's all about how you create a kind of sense of tension in your reader, um, and I mean, any kind of forward moving plot kind of can be assimilated into that idea. I mean, I'm quite interested in the atmosphere of genre thrillers, but without being very interested in the kind of the bit where it all gets tied up in a neat bow and you kind of you can close the book and forget about it. It's been a kind of clockwork mechanism to produce a sense of I don't know is he going to cling onto the edge of the building or is he going to get off? I mean, in some ways that feels like artificial and manipulative, but and maybe I mean maybe the analogy with games. I mean maybe if a thriller is a closed system with a set of determinate rules and a more to me more interesting kind of fiction has an open system but can still use these tools and techniques of I mean a lot of my books end up with kind of have journeys and road trips and maybe even chases in them. A lot of my books have doubles in them. They're often kind of characters who are, refractions or reflections of each other, and these are genre elements. But ultimately, I'm the guy who kind of gets bored in the last reel of the movie because I don't care about the moral accounting that happens at the end. I've been in it for the weird second act where you're not really sure whether it's real or not. I mean, and this is a book about ambiguity, and this is a book about that is something psychological or is it existing in the wider world.
mhm, mhm. Um, so Andrew poses a question about the narrator and the narrator's kind of descent into this kind of politicized paranoia, and wonders in some way if that escalates in part because of the character's tendency towards self-isolation. I mean, when he goes to the Deuter Center, which has these strange Baroque rules about how everyone's supposed to interact with each other, he refuses to do so. He refuses to talk to his wife. He sort of descends inward. Um, and it's something we've been talking about throughout the Institute and the class of which it's based, that somehow this kind of paranoid conspiracism of our age is bred in a highly alienated society.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of withdrawal from community and the withdrawal from relationships is the hallmark of a certain sort of quite problematic kind of masculinity
Mhm.
as well. The guy who won't go to the doctor, the guy who won't ask directions.
Mhm.
These this sort of need to be to feel autonomous, to feel like the idea that freedom is in some way a lack of mutual obligation to other people. All these ideas are political ideas that are
Mhm.
also bound up with a certain sort of psychology. And I mean, I did an interview about the book with Jacobin, the left wing publication, and we talked a lot in that about the thing that never occurs to this character is that solidarity with others could be a route out of his sense of crisis, that he could check in with other people and maybe there could be action that you could take in conjunction with other people that would, he never, it's all kind of, he is, this is a drama that takes place out, on the terrain of his selfhood. And I think that's a critique that the book has of a certain sort of liberal mindset, which does overvalue the individual and systematically undervalue uh, solidarity with others.
I want to tie it to a couple of things in our institute. One of them is that Cassie Thornton, who will join us on Thursday to talk about her project Hologram. Cassie's a social practice artist and has created basically a framework whereby people can come together and offer each other intellectual, psychological, or physical, mental, and social healthcare through a kind of Zoom platform. But they just concluded their first course exclusively for men, trying to kind of answer this problem that, I think your narrator points out, that he really has no other men he can talk to in his life, and there's not a lot of solidarity that he feels. And then the other thing I wanted to mention briefly is that Kira Milburn, who's with us in the room, and I'm going to pass on Kira's question in a second, just wrote a very good piece for Novara on freedom and the etiolated notion of freedom being promoted, for instance, by the UK government right now for their Freedom Day, where everyone gets to take off their masks. That was great. Well, Kira really called it ahead of time, and also just pointed out that this notion of a kind of individuated freedom is really a freedom towards loneliness that seems to lead to the kinds of paranoia and conspiracism that are depicted in the book. Kira's question to you, though, from our chat is, he wonders whether sort of to counter the idea that conspiracism is totally based on irony, one of the things that he's been talking to us a lot about is the cosmic right and the turn to wellness, spirituality, yoga communities that have increasingly embraced racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including sort of like the QAnon thing. But these folks tend to be completely sincere. They're really deep. It's not like, oh, I'm doing yoga ironically. They're really into it. What do you make of that? Is that part of the same? Is that feeding from the same trough, or is that something different?
I mean, again, I think there's a recapitulation of tendencies in early 20th century Europe. I mean, if you look at I mean, even slightly further back, kind of late 19th century onwards, the Völkisch movement in Germany, which believed in a kind of sort of cosmic return to organic living, which was interested in all sorts of things that are, at the root of today's kind of alternative spirituality culture. It became a conduit for fascism. It's a very different kind of style of thinking and being to the sort of uniformed, militarized, masculinist, Freikorps kind of fascism. But there is a lack of irony can take you to that place too. I mean, the phrase I heard for it, which I really like, is conspirituality, I mean, it's been around for a long time, and I mean, I've served my time in various kind of hippie beach places, and have always been struck by there's the receptivity to certain sorts of conspiracy thinking in that culture. If you see yourself as part of an alternative culture and that the mainstream is trying to cheat you or misinform you in some way, then your enemy's enemy is your friend. And certainly what's happening these days is that a lot of these people who would never dream of themselves as proto-fascists are kind of are becoming conduits for this stuff. I mean, anecdotally, I have a couple of married couple, white friends who live in India. He's a Sanskrit professor, and she works on a vaccination program, vaccinating people in rural villages, and funded by the Bill Gates Foundation. So that you can see a picture is emerging there. But they rode out the pandemic in Goa, and so a lot of their social life was with kind of people from this culture, and they're people who come out of that culture too. I mean, they're a pair of old hippies, really. But they found it was impossible to be around a lot of people because there's been a real shift in that in that culture, from just a sort of general chat about vibrations and massage to a much more kind of hard-edged assertion, especially anti-vax things, but also a kind of global conspiracy thinking that is very open to anti-Semitic thinking and you know all the usual soup of stuff that goes into Q.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, Maybe we'll come back to that in a second if we have a moment, but I wanted just, but in case we run out of time, I wanted to ask you, um, what, like, I know this is going to sound like a huge question, but like, why the novel now? If we, you know, we've discussed the kind of fragmentation of reality, the fragmentation of sociality into multiple different competing narratives. Also, the way that often the kind of narratives that people are spinning are chaotic in some ways. You know, like some of this conspirituality stuff is a kind of like a kind of a medley or a kind of all night DJ mix of everything in the
Yeah,
crate.
I mean, it's got everything from Atlantis to UFOs to, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, to, you know, chemtrails. I mean, it's all connected. The alpha and omega of this thing. I mean, there's a kind of the idea is, I mean, you know, when do you refuse a connection? When do you
Mm-hmm.
kind of, you know, what when it is when how do you make kind of judgments of value in a world which you believe it's all connected? But you know, the defense of the novel, I feel I might have given the same defense of the novel to you once before, and I mean, but it
Never
is,
gets old.
my defense of the novel is to do with its variousness. I mean,
Mm,
it's a funny, baggy, weird creature, the novel, but it's a very flexible kind of way of thinking and understanding, because it allows you to break a lot of rules and to kind of go from, you know, you can write essayistic disquisitions on something, and then you can go to the interiority of a character, then you can kind of iris out and do a big
mm,
system, sort of social system portrait of a situation that that character is in. And I think that flexibility and that ability to do different, you know, layers, really, like different kind of levels of
mm,
resolution as a is it makes it quite useful for understanding a deeply complex, fractured world that we live in. I mean, it's a, you know, the criticism of the novel is that it is ultimately a bourgeois form because it runs everything through character and psychology, and I think that's so sort of in its, I mean, that is the uh you know, you can't get beyond that. And so there is a sort of legitimate critique that says that, well, if you're funneling everything, if you need to funnel everything through the individual, you know, maybe that's distorting. You know, I don't know whether anyone successfully managed to write a novel without characters. That would be kind of an interesting thought experiment to do that. But I also think that there's a kind of because our idea about what it is to be a person, what it is to
mm,
be a self, let alone what it is to be a character in a novel, incorporates new developments in our thinking of all kinds. Then actually, you know, it is a flexible kind of form from that point of view.
mm-hmm. I was thinking, and I was reflecting back on the interview that we did now almost a decade ago, where I think I asked you the same question about, or a very similar question. And I was thinking, then I think we were talking about finance too, and the way that finance capital fragments and compartmentalizes the world and turns it into these kind of derivative products. And I was thinking in preparation for this question about Frederick Jameson's argument that ultimately the novel and the conspiracy theory have in common this desire to provide us a cognitive map, a kind of a way of thinking about the world that makes sense, that where all the pieces kind of fit together.
Yeah, I mean, we should. I mean, shouldn't let this part of the conversation slide without mentioning the book that really incorporates both these ideas in the perfect way, which is Don DeLillo's Libra, which is
Mm,
about a plot in the sense of a plot, a conspiracy to kill the president, John F. Kennedy, and the idea of plot, which is an art, you know, a novelist's plot, which is an artificial simplification of the kind that we were talking about right at the beginning of the conversation with
mm,
reference to Q. You know, plot is of course always about making this kind of storm of signals into something kind of understandable and dealable with and aesthetically pleasing. And in
Mm.
the same way, there's a kind of conspiracy, real ones and imagined ones have that same kind of formal simplification to them. And if people don't know that book, Run Don't Walk, it's a wonderful book that's a sort of musing about the ways that making fiction kind of can bleed over into political reality.
Well, that seems like a very good place to bring our conversation to a close with a recommendation for a DeLillo novel. Harry, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a real
Uh,
pleasure.
yeah, nice to talk to you as ever, Max, and yeah, thanks everybody for turning up.